This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Countless times in the past 13 months, since Russia invaded Ukraine, it's been mentioned that Russia is the world's biggest country. And it is vast, from Kaliningrad, nestled into Poland and the Baltic states in the west, to Vladivostok on the Pacific, and across those 11 time zones, 145 million people. At 22 inhabitants per square mile, Russia is one of the least densely populated places on Earth. But those stats, on their own, don't come close to telling the whole story. Millions more Russians have died than have been born in recent decades. Russian women don't have many children. Russian men are dying in large numbers. Watching these trends throughout the post-Soviet era has been Nicholas Eberstadt. He holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches and writes extensively on demographics and economic development. And he joins me now. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much, Ray. Good to talk to you again.
Let's start with the news that came out late last week, that the International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for President Vladimir Putin for alleged war crimes involving accusations that Russia's been forcibly taking Ukrainian children. It's so far a hard-to-determine number of people. Can it be enough to move a demographic needle?
It certainly can't be enough to move a demographic needle, but it may reveal the sort of thinking that animates the Kremlin. Putin has, for 20 years and more, had his own version of demographic policy. It's almost like a rancher who wants to have a bigger herd and is not so careful as to the health of the flock, but he'd like to have a greater head count. So he's been interested in raising births. His most effective pro-natal policy, I suppose, has been annexing territory that belonged to other countries. And here we see this idea that by capture of human beings, implicitly a country is, I guess, supposed to become stronger.
And you have no doubt that this is not, as the Russians insist, humanitarian relocation of children from a war zone for their own safety. But this is state policy from the very top?
Well, if it weren't state policy from the very top, I don't see how it could continue for 1 year and more.
Many of these children are being placed not with Russian-speaking families in disputed parts of Ukraine, but in Russia proper. There are pictures of on TV of smiling children being presented with Russian passports and taking Russian language classes. When you see these developments, what do you make of it as someone who's been watching this country closely for so long?
To begin with, as a parent, I'm horrified by this. It's state-sponsored kidnapping. As a student of Russian population, the kidnapping of some thousands or 16,000 maybe children isn't going to staunch the demographic decline of the Russian Federation. It's just an additional needless tragedy that's added to the population situation there.
Last year, Putin signed a decree making it easier for Russians to adopt and give citizenship to Ukrainian children without parental authorization. And he also, in the same law, made it harder for Ukraine and surviving relatives to win those children back. It seems, as you mentioned, almost impossibly cruel. But can anybody lay a finger on Vladimir Putin? Can anybody, including the International Criminal Court, really stop this kind of thing?
Well, Putin is in unchallenged authority in the Russian Federation, and he'll be in unchallenged authority until he isn't. And I don't have a crystal ball about this. I can tell you that for 30 years and more now, deaths have exceeded births by a cumulative total of more than 15 million in Russia. The country is shrinking and aging, and other people's children isn't going to change that situation.
Is the war making Russia's already existing demographic challenges, like the one you just alluded to, even harder?
Of course it is, in a couple of different respects. There are two emigrations that are occurring because of the invasion of Ukraine. One, of course, is the refugees who've fled from Ukraine. The other is the refugees who fled from the Russian Federation, who are out of sympathy with this dark turn in already the kind of dark tendencies in Russian politics. I don't have a good head count for you on how many people have left. One ballpark that's given is maybe 1 million people. Disproportionately, they are young. Disproportionately, they are English speakers, highly educated, disproportionately IT. A lot of human capital has left Russia in the last year because of the war. The other aspect, of course, is the casualties, the additional mortality from the casualties, the families that have been disrupted by the war, the babies that have not been born because of the war. Russia has announced its birth figures, and they dropped once again. This gap between deaths and births is not narrowing over the foreseeable future. There is one thing that has happened. Last month, the parliament, the Duma, passed an edict that has kind of given the statistical officials permission for not releasing demographic or GNP or inflation numbers if they feel so fit. So it sounds almost as if we are heading back to the USSR, where inconvenient numbers are going to be suppressed, perhaps. That's probably not a very good signal about what the Kremlin thinks it lies in store.
That number you gave about the excess number of deaths over births is stunning. But we should also mention that one place, if you look on the world table of fertility, one place that was as pretty low as Russia was Ukraine. And now with their millions of refugees out of the country, with large numbers of reproduction age men dying, their crisis is being worsened by this war too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Some of the characteristics that we see in the Russian population are echoed in the population of Ukraine. Maybe not surprising, since they both were part of the Soviet experiment for 70 years. Low fertility, a lot of health problems for working age people, especially for men. This high levels of formal education and yet seemingly low levels of human capital in terms of health and knowledge production, things like that. Ukraine is going to have some real challenges when this war ends and when reconstruction commences. And it's probably not too soon to think about how the demography and the economics of a successful reconstruction might proceed.
I've been watching a lot of video from the war front, and it's only after you're watching it for a while that you realize, or you think about, when those men running around in camo were born. At the early end of the range, men in their 20s were born in a damaged but rebuilding Russia. Men in their 30s, also subject to being called up to military service, were born in a chaotic country in free fall. What did Russian birth rates look like then? And is that having an effect today in 2023 on Russia's prosecution of this war?
Well, Russia's birth rates spun downward during the last years of Soviet rule and during the chaotic transition to the new Russia in the early 1990s, they were very low. They recovered slightly in the mid-90s, and they kind of dropped again after the economic panic and the bank panic of 98. They recovered under Putin in some measure, and Putin linked the recovery of births directly and explicitly to national security. He came out with an expensive and ambitious pro-natal policy, and after that policy, births increased to some degree, but never got back to the level that would be needed for population stability, then dropped again despite the continuation of that program. So the number of young men 18 years old, let's say a kind of a notional conscript for the Russian army. About 860,000 young men for the foreseeable future will be rising through the population. That may seem like more than enough to prosecute a limited war against a neighbor, but in practical terms, when one considers that some people have to go on for training, some people have to work, some people have other obligations, it does not mean that there is plentiful military manpower for this operation indefinitely. We're not back to General Zhukov smothering the Nazis with Soviet bodies.
For a long time, it seemed like Russia was able to paper over some of this by both bringing in ethnic Russians who were leaving the now independent republics of the former Soviet Union, and also economic migrants who were ethnically Kazakh and Uzbek and Kyrgyz and so on. Have those non-Russian minorities become a larger share of the population, and does that have political implications?
That's a really good question, right? So how should we put it? The gathering of the Russians rather than the gathering of the Russias was more or less a once-only effect that happened in the 1990s after the breakup of the USSR. And many millions of Russian ethnics moved to the Russian Federation. Pretty much by the mid-1990s, it seems, almost anybody who was ethnically Russian who had wanted to go to the Russian Federation had done so. And there hasn't been much of that since. Some, but not much. Most of the migrants, as you indicate, subsequently are from the near abroad, non-Russian ethnics, largely of Muslim cultural or historical background, origin. It's becoming a bit more complex to assimilate and integrate these migrants into Russian economy and society now, in part because not so many people are taught Russian anymore in the countries from which they're coming. And with less language skills and less education in many cases, they're more likely to be separated from the rest of the population. The same nationalism that the government has tried to utilize or instrumentalize in other ways has unintended consequences in attitudes maybe towards some of these migrants, and that probably doesn't help much either.
One thing that makes, I guess, the birth dearth even more high impact is that people are dying younger in Russia, too. I keep reading about how, especially among men, the life expectancy continues to decline. If you're making steel or digging coal or putting together a car, are there enough men to do this work?
Well, if people are educated and productive, they can do a lot of work, I guess. The problem that I see is the terribly high mortality levels for working age men, also for working age women. If we can believe the World Health Organization's estimates, life expectancy before COVID, on the eve of the COVID explosion, which had devastating impacts in Russian Federation, as we know, but on the eve of the COVID explosion, life expectancy for a 15-year-old guy in Russia was about the same as for a 15-year-old guy in Haiti. I mean, this is really almost impossible to imagine, right? And in Haiti, people are dying of diseases of poverty and of communicable diseases. But in Russia, somehow they've managed to achieve similar levels of premature mortality, mainly through deaths from injury, murder, suicide, accidents, and cardiovascular, which I suspect has a lot to do with drinking and stress.
These numbers showed up a long time ago. Watching from the outside, I guess the remarkable thing is that they are so persistent, even as the country went through some economic good times earlier in these first decades of the 21st century. The oil taps were full open, the gas lines were full and a lot of money was pouring into Russia, and there was still what in the American context is often called deaths of despair, alcoholism, untreated mental illness, suicide. What's going on?
Well, in fairness, I think that the trends in the United States are a little bit too close to an echo of what we see in Russia for comfort in our country. But the mother and the originator of these patterns was first the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation. Russia did have a recovery and some improvement in health statistics and health performance in the early 21st century. It finally broke the barrier of 70 years in life expectancy at birth for the country as a whole. Now, that was something amazingly that this European society hadn't done until the 2010s. But you have to remember, the world is a moving target, and Russia did not achieve a life expectancy of 70 until the global life expectancy was well above 70. So it was still kind of trying to catch up with the global average. The global average includes a lot of low-income countries. Since the COVID catastrophe, of course, there's been a terrible setback in life expectancy in the Russian Federation. We can expect them to recover from that, but the trajectory, I think, is pretty problematic.
With much fanfare, the allies without limit, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, have been getting together. You've also been looking at China's numbers, and they're fascinating too. Last year, the country announced that its population declined for the first time in 6 decades. That announcement was greeted with a lot of commentary, but wasn't it expected after decades of the one-child policy?
Ray, it was expected. The surprise was when it was expected. On the eve of the COVID explosion, demographers at the United Nations, demographers at the Census Bureau, independent demographers were saying, well, maybe this prolonged below replacement fertility trend will lead to a peaking and a decline in China's total numbers in the early 2030s. So the actual decline occurred about 10 years before the previous consensus had presumed. And the reason that it occurred a decade earlier was not because of tens of millions of COVID deaths in China, as best we can tell. There have been more deaths than the government admitted, but it was maybe in the hundreds of thousands or the very low millions. The real driver there was a collapse in birth totals after the one-child policy was suspended in 2015. It was most unexpected, unpredicted, but between 2016 and 2022, to go by the official figures from Beijing, birth totals dropped by almost 50%. That's a really sharp drop to see in 6 years of peacetime. If it had been a famine, if it had been a war, maybe you could have seen something that would, shake the needle like that. But during times of orderly progress, a 50% drop in that short a time period just isn't seen.
Well, as you mentioned, when the one-child policy was lifted, people in their 20s and 30s kind of met it with a shrug. They didn't start having more kids. Does something like that, a policy like that, after a while become social habit? Do people grow up with the expectation of not having large families? Does it become a sort of lifestyle question? How do we get to the point where when the government finally says, okay, we're not doing that anymore, everybody else just says, well, we're not having more kids either?
Well, I guess it turned out that China wasn't Animal Farm after all, didn't it? And, when the policy was suspended, the government very explicitly said births are a national matter, meaning that it wasn't just parents who got to choose how many kids were going to be born. The government, in this sort of Aesopian, esoteric communication way that was quite common under Mao, came out with a new postage stamp that showed two smiling pigs and three happy little piglets, and everybody's supposed to know what they mean. But I think the problem was that Chinese people aren't pigs, and they didn't feel like they were supposed to be pigs either. And the government wasn't quite as good at using bayonets to make people have more kids.
I was living in China recently, and whenever I met someone in a less formal, less business-like setting, I wasn't going to be inappropriate with people I just met, I would always ask them, do you have any cousins? Do you have any aunts or uncles? To sort of get a feel for what this does to a society over a long period of time. The people who said, oh, I have a cousin or I have two cousins were more likely to be people who grew up in rural areas. But if they were urban, forget it. They not only had no cousins, but they had no aunts or uncles either. And it was kind of mind-blowing to see that become so normal.
It isn't it? And especially for a country with a Confucian heritage. The metaphysics of Confucianism is the idea that all will be right with the world if the family can be continued through the issue of the male, right? Through this male lineage thing. But I mean, Confucius must be spinning in looking at what's happening in China today, because it's a complete departure from 2,500 years of tradition.
It is one thing to look at the trends in Russia and think, well, look, this started in the Soviet period. They've had a lot of economic downdraft. Life is tough in Nizhny Novgorod and Magnitogorsk and places away from Moscow. But when you look right next door at the country that's grown its GDP exponentially in the last 30 years, they've had a lot of good times in that same period as Russian demographics were cratering. China isn't exactly going wild having kids either. What can you take away from that?
Well, there's been a sort of a cottage industry and demography for a century and a half trying to establish what causes fertility trends. Most of this, I think, is inconclusive. My own takeaway from it is that the absolutely most important factor, and I know this will shock you, is how many kids women want to have, which is nice because we're not rabbits and we're not robots, right? What I read from this is there must have been an absolute thunderclap of a change in mentality in China under Xi Jinping, because something has happened that has caused this extraordinary drop in births that began way before the COVID catastrophe. So what is it that has made this change? It's hard for me to think that it still could be an optimistic society. It kind of smells and looks kind of like a reaction of despair or discouragement.
A lot of young Chinese women I met who were, because I was in Shanghai and largely confined to Shanghai by COVID, they were more likely educated. Many had spent some time in the West. They were very aspirational. And both husbands and children seemed like options rather than something that they felt that they absolutely must have in their lives. I think there's a lot of that in the United States as well, but it was sobering to see how widespread it was in China.
Up until now, demographers have worked with the numbers that, the governments offer them. So we do head counts on the U.S., head counts on China. We know the population is shrinking. We know it's aging. But these birth changes and these marriage trend changes are making a revolution in family structure in China. And that, the family is imploding. And that's a hugely consequential phenomenon for any country. But in China, where the family has been, the social basis of nation and civilization for thousands of years, it may have even a little bit of an extra, kind of consequence for the future.
When you, as a numbers guy, play out these trends both in Russia and China, granted, the trajectory is going to be a little different for the two countries because of the economic tracks they're on, but what does 2050 look like if you're looking out at your vast country from the Kremlin or from the Gate of Heavenly Peace, what happens in these intervening 20 or so years to get you to the mid-century?
Well, of course, both countries are on a path to depopulation and graying, and pronounced population graying. I kind of feel that, I can't prove this, but I just kind of have a sense that part of Putin's approach over the past generation has been to behave in an increasingly risky manner internationally to sort of compensate for the demographic losses and the loss of influence, economic, human resource influence that the country has had. I mean, that's not an approach that I think can continue forever, and we may be seeing that right now. In China, there has been, in many quarters, a notion that the 21st century is supposed to be China's century. Well, we've just seen peak China in a headcount way. If current birth trends continue, the next generation in China will be less than half as large as the current childbearing group. That speaks to a very steep impending population decline. Now, countries can maintain prosperity and increase prosperity while they're aging and shrinking. You can take a look at Germany, for example. But I think it's going to be a lot harder to do that in a no-reform China of the sort that Xi Jinping's Chinese dream seems to be implying lies ahead.
You know, you alluded to it earlier, and I don't want to just let it lie there. The United States is not exactly setting any records. The maternity wards are not stuffed. But if you look across a large number of countries, that's the case. There is a long list of countries that are at zero population growth or below, that are rapidly aging, and they're very diverse places, as rich and as forward-charging as South Korea, as muddled as Serbia, and a lot of places in between. It may be a pretty complicated social realities coming to a lot of countries by mid-century, no?
Absolutely right. I mean, as we speak, the latest numbers from the UN Population Division suggest that maybe 3/4 of the world's population today lives in countries with below replacement fertility levels. It's not exactly the population bomb that we heard about a while ago. India is below replacement. Bangladesh is below replacement. Nepal is below replacement. Iran is below replacement. Turkey, almost all of Latin America. This future that we have coming at us sort of relentlessly looks like one in which there's going to be less working age manpower than we thought until quite recently, a lot more older people. It's happening very slowly. It's happening day by day, and we've got a lot of time to adjust and prepare, and I hope that we will, because as I say, just as the population explosion didn't immiserate us, I think that a population implosion does not mean we're going to head into, kind of a turn out the lights moment. We can maintain and improve prosperity if we increase our human resources and have relatively intelligent policies and, practices.
But societies all over the planet that instead of having old people as deferred to, treasured, and rare people in a town, in a village, in an apartment complex, half the people are going to be over 60 in a lot of places. And that's got to mean some different social realities.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of things have to change tremendously. And it just seems to me it's so ironic. We've never had as many people on the planet as we have now, and yet there's so much loneliness. And that's got to do with the social relations you're describing.
Nicholas Eberstadt, always a pleasure to pick your brain. Good to talk to you. And thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Thanks so much, Ray. Always great.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Matteo Schimpf and Andrew Stelzer. Additional production help was provided by our associate producer, Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Our executive producer is Jared Sport. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.